Hello, everyone. Hi, I wasn't quite sure if we were on yet. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for Sci-Fi Summer with Cadwell Turnbull. I'm so excited to be here with you all. I am Allison Carvalho, the events manager for Barbara's Bookstores, and I'm incredibly excited to be hosting this event. Barbara's has been a Chicago institution since 1963, and we are so excited to be bringing you this virtual event as well as many others. We are a family-owned and operated bookstore, and we pride ourselves on creating community spaces within and outside of our stores, just like these events. Before we begin our discussion, I want to give you a quick tour of Crowdcast for those of you who haven't used it before. Firstly, we are new to virtual events, so please keep that in mind with us in case we have any technical issues. If things end up going sideways, just bear with us. We're going to get things back up and running as quickly as we can. Also, do not forget to feel free to chat on the side of your screen with fellow book lovers. We always love hearing what books you have going on. We'll also be including links to other events and more information about what we have going on. Also, if you happen to notice your video is freezing, please use the little gear icon that you'll see if you hover on the screen to the right and click your HD setting to 360. What that can do is it'll just kind of help with the lag if we're having any lag issues. The last 10 to 15 minutes of the event will be reserved for questions, so please make sure to think about questions as we're having our discussion and use the Ask a Question feature on the bottom of the screen in order to ask anything. And also don't forget to check out the Ask a Question feature if you haven't asked one, because as people are asking, you can click to upvote those questions. Alrighty. Oh, and most importantly, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see a button that says click here to purchase your copy of the lesson. That link will take you to our website where you can purchase your own copy of this incredible book. And you can also purchase it at our bookstores as well. Just make sure to call ahead and check if they have the copy available at the store near you. And lastly, we want to make sure that this is an informative and fun space. So we ask that everyone please be respectful and kind to your fellow book lovers as you're chatting and throughout the event. I think that's everything. We're going to go ahead and we're going to bring our author to the screen. This author's short fiction has been featured in such magazines as Asimov's Science Fiction, Lightspeed, and Nightmare, as well as anthologies The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2018 and Year's Best Science Fiction and Fantasy 2019. His debut novel, The Lesson, has been featured on many best lists, as well as nominated for the Sovas Award in Fiction, the Audi Award in Science Fiction, and the AAMBC Literary Award, as well as many, many other accolades. I am incredibly excited to bring to the screen Cadwell Turnbull. Hello,
Hey.
Cadwell. How's it going? I'm
good. How you doing?
Doing good, doing good. I'm so incredibly excited to have you here. I read the book and I loved it so much. So I'm super pumped to be having this conversation with you.
Thank you so much.
I'd love to start, of course. I'd love to start by hearing a bit about your writing journey. Were you always interested in writing science fiction? Is that kind of the genre where you feel most at home? Tell us a little bit about that.
I would say that, yeah, I always wanted to do this. Before I started writing science fiction, I was reading science fiction and watching a lot of science fiction. My favorite TV show as a kid was Stargate Sg-1, for example. So it was always in my head. I always wanted to do it. But it has been a journey, me figuring out how to do it in a way that I felt was doing all the things I wanted it to do. So I went to an MFA and I went to some workshops and I developed the craft that I thought was necessary to tell these kinds of stories in a way that I thought would be compelling.
Yes. I'd love to hear a little bit about your, specifically the idea for the lesson. So the story tells the story of an alien invasion and colonization on an island in the Virgin Islands. Where did the inspiration for that story come from?
I had a nightmare. it was a few years ago. It was a few years before I started writing the book, and it was set in a small town, and there were aliens that had integrated into the society there. They looked like humans. They acted like humans, except when they got upset, they would kill people. And the nightmare stuck with me for a while, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it. But eventually, when I was doing my MFA, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to transplant this idea to the Virgin Islands? And so once I made that decision, the rest of the story kind of developed from there.
Yes. And that was actually a really big important thing for me, was the fact that it was set in the Virgin Islands. I'm Caribbean myself, and so I felt like I related so much to what I was reading. I felt like I knew some of the characters personally. And I'd love to hear. I'm from Jamaica.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's
I'm
great.
first generation American, but my parents are from Jamaica and they moved here. And so I got to visit many times, and I feel like, and I know many of my family members still live there. So it's really wonderful to get a chance to read a book that I feel like I relate to in a really real way. So it was just really incredible.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah. I'd love to hear about kind of, I can understand being a Caribbean person that you wanted to kind of, there's this whole thing about own voices, kind of this concept of making sure that you're telling stories of your own experience. And so I think a lot of science fiction is kind of centered in the Western world in a very specific way. And so I'd love to kind of hear the importance and kind of what motivated you to really want to put it in the Virgin Islands and kind of focus it there.
Well, I mean, I'd watched a lot of movies growing up about aliens invading different parts of the United States or other places in the world. And I thought that it would be really interesting to set an alien invasion somewhere that you didn't get all the time. And it made sense to do that in the Virgin Islands where I grew up. I thought that, wouldn't this be a really cool story to tell? These aliens coming to the Virgin Islands. And the way that the Virgin Island people would interact with the aliens would be very different from someone from, say, Washington, D.C. or New York. They would be bringing their own local history to that interaction. And so looking at the Virgin Islands and this history of, being invaded, being colonized, it seemed like a really good fit to explore alien invasions through that lens.
Oh yeah, for sure. I was gonna say I have a whole question about that, but I want to ask this question first. So a lot of the book, it's very concentrated in kind of a very small community. It's this community, not only on a smaller island, but also a smaller community of these families. And I think a lot of times when people think about sci-fi, they think of it in a lot grander of a sense. It's about whole planets exploding, big, huge battles. And so I'd love to hear about kind of the thought process of bringing that story in and kind of concentrating it in a more, through a smaller lens versus taking it to kind of that bigger, wider impact. Like, we hear about some of how this invasion has impacted the world through news reports and things like that. But at the end of the day, we're experiencing it through these people. And so I'd love to kind of hear about the process of creating that community.
Right. I felt like it would be more realistic to tell a story where the advanced aliens show up and the world doesn't know what to do. There's not really this great attack strategy to respond to these aliens arriving. And I mean, it doesn't even make sense. It's interesting when you watch movies like Independence Day that you have the military can destroy the aliens with a computer virus. That's not how it would happen or how I imagine it would happen in real life. So I wanted to tell a story where the aliens show up and it's unquestioned that they would destroy us if they needed to. But they aren't here for that. They're here for research. And they're giving us things in exchange. The problem is, most of the world is benefiting from those technologies that the aliens are bringing, but the Virgin Islands is suffering the effects. They're the ones that are taking on all of the conflict. And so for me, it made sense to not tell that story through like military action or a super spy, but to tell the story through, a guy that works at the legislature with the alien ambassador, family members, his neighbors, someone that has experienced a loss at the hands of the Ynaa. That just seemed to me like a story worth telling and a story that I hadn't seen a lot before.
Definitely. Yeah, that was one of the striking things for me, was just how personal everything kind of felt. And it was, I know, maybe for me personally, with everything that we've been experiencing going on, I felt like there were a lot of parallels, especially in a mixture of government response and also the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, where there's a lot of inherent parallels just in people kind of not knowing what to do or how to handle kind of a major shift. And especially kind of the same way that we're experiencing the coronavirus right now, where it's kind of unexpected. This alien invasion kind of had that similar vibe of just like out of nowhere, this big thing came and changed everyone's lives. And everyone is kind of like, I don't know what to do. And so I just thought that was incredibly fascinating. Do you kind of feel like, did you feel like you were kind of having any prescient moments while you were writing the book, kind of trying to imagine that stuff? And now looking back, are you kind of seeing, how are you experiencing those parallels?
Yeah.
I know that was like a heavy question.
Yeah. Okay. So with the stuff around Black Lives Matter, I wrote a big part of this book like right after the like Eric Garner, Freddie Gray stuff. And it seems, I was talking to someone recently about the fact that we're responding to it the way that we should have responded to it the last several times it's happened. There's been like waves of this. And so I wanted to tell the story of someone who I consider to be directly harmed by the Ynaa, and have them. And there's a riot that happens in the book. There's a response that one of the characters. It's kind of a spoiler, but it seemed to me important to like look at the relationship between the Ynaa and the humans through that similar lens of like police brutality. And so I was doing a little bit of that while I was also like trying to connect it to colonialism. I can't talk about one thing that happens at the end of the book that I feel is really interesting now, considering like what's been happening with COVID. Like there's a decision that I made that I thought I was like, are people gonna have trouble believing something like this? And now, in the era of COVID, I feel much differently about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it is 100% spoilers, so we're not going to talk about it. But I know exactly what you're talking about, and I totally see that.
Right.
So I'd love to talk a little bit about kind of the invasion itself. So you begin the book right before the invasion, and then there's a time jump to 5 years later. And so what kind of motivated you to want to kind of not have any scenes of the moment itself when people start interacting with the aliens and stuff like that? Was it kind of mostly focused on the fact that you kind of had the dream of them already being integrated? Was there a reason why you didn't want to like have the actual scene of like alien meet man moment?
That was part of it. Like I did have in the dream, the aliens had already integrated into society. And so that was a part of the story that I was interested in telling. But I also felt like we get a lot of the initial response to aliens arriving. And I wanted to jump forward a bit and tell a story about people already sort of acclimated to the fact that they're there. So like in the novel, there's locals have interactions with aliens in bars, on the street. they know who they are. They recognize the different aliens, and it felt to me like this would be interesting, like this integration into the culture. And the aliens, for the most part, look exactly like a local would. They move a bit differently. There's ways that if you're paying attention, you can know that this is an Ynaa. But for the most part, they have to recognize those aliens through memory. They have to know who they are and see their faces and be like, oh yeah, that's Mira, or that's
right,
so and so.
Like that's that one alien.
yeah. And so I thought that was just like an interesting thing to play with.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I thought that was, especially the fact that it wasn't just, I think a lot of times people will find ways that they want to have their aliens assimilate into society. It'll be like, but every alien has bright yellow eyes, or they have like one weird thing. And the fact that yours, it kind of was just like, you just got to know them. If you know them, then you know. Otherwise, they really could just entirely assimilate. And also the fact that they'd have that kind of like jerky movement, which I thought was kind of an interesting kind of ode to. It made me think a little bit of Men in Black and like the Edgar suit. Kind of that idea of
yeah,
like an alien that just can't quite fit into the skin of a human, as like a wider allegory beyond just the literal fact that the alien can't quite fit in, but also that like physical can't fit in.
Right. I was thinking about, in terms of the jerky moments as well, the fact that the aliens have like, they're very long lived. They live a really long time. And they're used to minimal movement. There's an interaction within the book that is between Mira, the ambassador, and a very old Ynaa. And it's noticeable that he's much older because he's very slow until he's not. And so there's this kind of movement I thought was really interesting to like try to bring that into like the human context. Like, how would that movement look to a human? It would look kind of jerky.
For sure. One thing I thought was incredibly fascinating was there's some deep dives into history that I thought was really cool, especially talking about the indigenous peoples of the Virgin Islands, as well as like people that were brought over because of slavery and things like that. I'd like to hear a little bit about your research into that. What was it like kind of researching the history of the Virgin Islands and figuring out ways to incorporate that history within the book?
It was equal parts like traumatic and really dull. You know, I read a lot of history books in order to like try to render those moments in like the slave insurrection. I was lucky enough to find a book that is like a historical fiction. It's like it's a historian that's telling a fiction story of the insurrection, and then I connected that to some other references. I went to St. John and got like a map of the island during that time, so like what plantations were where. But then I also just read a dissertation that was about the Kwamu people, the tribe that is enslaved and then starts the insurrection in St. John. And I also had a like this really big book about Danish slave society. So like just like there was in the book, there was the number of slaves in any given year. There was the cultural practices of the slaves, like what they wore, what they ate, how they slept. And there was all of this additional context about how the Danish would punish the slaves if the slaves ran away. There was, I mean, some of the stuff was like deeply disturbing.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
Right. And so and reading that stuff was traumatic, but it was also, you know, the way that it was written, it was very like, it didn't carry the weight of what was actually happening, what it was discussing. It was talking about like human dismemberment, but like in a very matter-of-fact way.
Like almost like a clinical way.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
I feel like so much of history kind of is presented like that.
Exactly. And so even the historical account of the fictional historical account of the slave insurrection kind of glossed over the insurrection, and that stuff was also detailed in a very clinical way. And so I had to it was interesting, but sometimes I had to make myself continue to read because it was just a lot to take in, and also it was just difficult to read.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And I could definitely kind of feel that while I was reading it, where I was having these moments of like, okay, whew, got to take some deep breaths, got to kind of process all of this. And like, it was interesting because the brutality that the Ynaa are exhibiting on the islanders, it was like there were so many parallels between just that level of brutality, but just the fact that the brutality was committed by human beings. Like, I think it's easier for us to be able to create that disconnect when it's like it's an alien. Like, we're never going to understand an alien, so we're not going to be able to figure out what that is. But when it comes to human beings, it's like we're still figuring out what that cruelty can look like. And so I thought it was just fascinating being able to see that kind of back and forth, and like seeing it like page next to page,
Right.
Like, I just read a whole thing about some true history that happened, and then like a page later, some crazy stuff happens, and you have to go like, oh, but that is not that far away from that.
Right. And I kind of wanted to make those parallels, and so it was really interesting to try to make that juxtaposition. So there's a section, the section that you're talking about, I'm trying not to say too much.
I'm so sorry. Right? It's so hard. We want to talk about so much.
Like, I was just about to say something that there's a reason why there's so many flashbacks, and there's someone in those flashbacks that's relaying, that's drawing parallels between their own experience and what they're experiencing with the slaves. And I mean, could I spoil that thing? So like that. Okay, I won't say it. Okay.
Don't say it, because it's so great, and I want people to get to experience it, because to me it was a really impactful moment the first time I kind of figured out what was going on there. So I feel like I hope that we're giving enough like shaded conversation that people get really curious and then want to grab the book. That's what I'm hoping happens here.
Okay.
Because it's just so wonderful. So I want to talk a little bit about the characters. So as I said, I related very, very heavily to a lot of the characters in the book. And like every time in my head, I'd hear someone go like, ch, like just like they like do that thing with the exactly. Like I would hear that and I'd be like, see, in Jamaica, at least in my family, we do a lot of that, and we do a lot of like cha, and like I could just hear it in my head so clearly. I want to hear a little bit about like what were kind of the fun, interesting details about the island that you wanted to make sure ended up in the book, or like people that maybe related to characters that you put in the book.
Right. I wanted to show like one of the things that happens in like the very first section of the book is you get like a kind of like a aerial view of the harbor, and there's like cruise ships coming in, and these cruise ships are like massive. They're so big that they kind of block out the mountain behind it. Like they're this big like thing coming in from the horizon, and I was drawing some parallels there with the aliens when they arrive. And so I wanted to show that the Virgin Islands is used to having, these like regular visits from outside, and that the Disney cruise line has like this like horn of na, 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 na. And so I also wanted to show that like you can hear that in the morning when the cruise ship is coming in. But also I was just like, I wanted to show some of the problems that we have with I think we lost Allison for a second. Uh-oh.
There we go. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what was I saying?
You were talking about the cruise ships and kind of showing a picture of the life on the island.
Yeah. So I wanted to show the harbor. I also wanted to show, like, in the mornings when the family gets up, there you can hear like a rooster outside. There's cats in the bush and iguanas in the trees, and so I wanted to show like the wildlife and some of the, like, we do have a problem with like strays, so we have like a lot of wild cats, and so I wanted to show that as well. I wanted to show the nightlife. So there's like a few areas that I knew I wanted to have in the book. There's Frenchtown, where there's a bunch of restaurants where people go, and and there's like a bar park across the street from the restaurants, and it's right next to the water. And there's out Red Hook, which is like makes a brief appearance, and there's Hull Bay, which is like a beach that's really hard to get to. And so a lot of what I wanted to do was show like different spots of the island that if you were from the place, you'd be like, oh yeah, that place, I know that place. And and I also wanted to just like show the people. And so there's like, scenes where different characters in the book are interacting with someone on the street or someone in a neighborhood. And that was important for me as well, to try to get as much of, I was dealing with, there's a lot of character perspectives in the book, but those character perspectives are quite limited. So I wanted to get more diversity through interaction.
Yeah. That was something that I wanted to ask you about too, was kind of the choice to show so many different perspectives. I felt like it gave the opportunity for almost kind of like a helicopter view of everything by doing that. Was that kind of the purpose, was you wanted to be able to expand beyond just one character and show like kind of the different ways that this was affecting people?
Yeah, I thought it would be smart to show how different people would relate to the aliens and how they would bring their own personal experiences and biases. And to me, it felt like you would get a fuller picture of the experience of being occupied by the Ynaa if you got a lot of different takes on what that occupation means. Like some of the characters relate to the Ynaa through their religion. Some of them relate to the Ynaa through their upbringing, their history. There's a character in the book that is going through a midlife crisis, and he relates to the aliens in this kind of like, he wants to document the invasion, and so he's relating to it through this kind of like through narrative. And so it felt like it made sense to me to give all of these different takes, because that's how it would happen in the real world. Like if aliens were to show up, I would relate to it in a very different way than my neighbor, than my sibling, than my parents. And that different relationship to the aliens is important and valuable. I didn't want to like prioritize one over the other.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Let me see. So we talked a little bit about kind of how this book relates to the current time we're in. I'd love to hear kind of your perspective on the way science fiction has maybe changed, especially your experience with it maybe as a kid and when you first began writing science fiction versus kind of the way that it's looking right now, especially in our current climate. I kind of just want to hear a little bit about kind of your perspective on where sci-fi is kind of at right now. Because I think it's kind of even just like from the beginning of 2020 to now, I think there's definitely, you can easily have a completely different experience and perspective on it.
Right. I mean, I think that the big thing that I would say that's different now is that there's just so many different people writing science fiction. It's way more diverse than it used to be. And so because it's diverse, people are using science fiction in different ways. So like when I wrote this book, I wanted to look at who we are now and use aliens as like as a thematic thing to discuss and critique our current society, and to talk about things that I felt was really important to the history of the Virgin Islands and to me as a person. And so, you know, earlier science fiction, there was always a critique, but there was also like this exploration of this sense of wonder, this looking towards where we're headed. And I think that a lot of science fiction now, especially science fiction from diverse people, are looking at who we are, or using the tools of science fiction to discuss and critique who we are and what we are, who we want to be. And I think that that's really important. And it's like, it's a valuable addition to the field.
Definitely. Well, and I think I experience sci-fi differently because of that wide array of voices too. Because I know my favorite TV show when I was a kid was The Twilight Zone. Mm-hmm. And like, it's really cool to kind of have an opportunity to relate a little bit more deeply to what I'm experiencing. I felt like I could always kind of watch The Twilight Zone with a sense of distance, not just because of the time period in which it happened, but also just because I wasn't necessarily seeing myself within those stories.
Right.
And like, that was a large part for me of what made this book so wonderful, was I felt like for the first time in a while, I felt like I was like, oh, I know these people. And I can totally see where this would play out this way. It just was really cool to get to experience it that way. And knowing that there's so many books that are coming out now that kind of have that same idea of like, we're going to talk through this lens. We're going to let this person tell this story their way and allow other people to get to experience it. It's just really awesome. So yeah, sorry, I got on my little soapbox for a second. Bear with me.
No, I completely agree, man. And it's just so good to think about the future and include all of humanity in it. You know, a lot of the shows that I love and that I watched growing up, there was a person of color, but they were a token. And now I get to read a lot of science fiction where they're everyone, they're everywhere, and it's beautiful and incredibly important. For
sure. Oh, okay, no more feelings for me. Gotta focus back. Okay, so my last question for you before we open it up to people to ask questions, which, by the way, if you haven't had a chance to, make sure to check out the Ask a Question feature and pop a question down there or upvote any questions that you're interested in hearing. Are there any specific sci-fi books that you think would be great for people to read that you'd want to recommend people get into?
Yes, I actually made a pile. So this is I would say my favorite sci-fi book is The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin.
Yes, it's so good.
It's my favorite book. Her Body and Other Parties. I've been reading a lot of short fiction collections, and this is by Carmen Maria Machado. It's horror, but you know, it's under the speculative umbrella. Yeah, there's also some science fiction stories in here. So, Karen Joy Fowler, What I Didn't See. It's a story collection. She also writes wonderful novels. Ted Chiang. So this is his first collection, Stories of Your Life. But I also recommend Exhalation. And I have this massive Le Guin novella novelette collection as well that I highly recommend. It's called The Found and the Lost.
Yes.
And one more novel.
Okay, please.
The Moon and the Other by John Kessel. I saw it on my shelf, so I brought it down. This is wonderful. So yeah.
Yes. Could you actually, if I could ask, would you be willing to type those up in an email to me, and then we'll make sure to share them on our social media?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
That would be amazing. Because I think that would be great to have like a recommended list that we can pop on our Instagram and our Facebook for everyone to write. Awesome. All right, great. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead to the questions. All right. So our first question is from Elias Krim. Let's see. Can sci-fi create utopian, not just dystopian visions? Can it make new social imaginaries of what a different society would look like? Would that be too boring? Grinning.
Yes, it can. I recommended The Dispossessed, and The Dispossessed is, according to Le Guin herself, is ambiguous utopia. So it's an imagined better world. It's not a perfect world, but it is a better one, and it is very interesting and compelling. It's not boring at all. There's another book by Kim Stanley Robinson called Pacific Edge. That's also a utopia. It takes a slightly different approach to it, but it's also really compelling. I mean, some people might have a different feeling about it because it talks about law a lot. But I thought it was a very great, very good read, and it's doing a lot of the stuff that you're describing. And yeah, I write about it all the time. I wrote a short story for Asimov science fiction called When the Rains Come Back, and it was imagining a panarchist utopia. It's a system of government where people can choose their government, and there's a whole variety of different types of governments you can choose from, and you can be a part of many different governments. And I explore that in a similar way to The Dispossessed. It's ambiguous. There's some ways that it's better. There's some ways that it's complicated. And so, yeah, I think that it's a worthy project. And I think if you want to tell a story about a utopian world, you can do it in a way that's interesting. People have done it.
Yeah. Awesome. Our next question is from Jess. What about science fiction as a genre do you think is well suited or not to telling character-rich stories?
The challenge for science fiction, I think, often is you have to, the science. You have to, there is, I mean, and I wouldn't consider my my novel particularly science rich. There's not a lot of science going on. I did do some research on immortal cells and different kinds of technologies, and I try to have a science fiction element to the fiction, but it is a challenge to write about science in a way that is compelling and engaging, and it takes up room in the story. So if you're going to tell a story set on the moon, like Kessel's The Moon and the Other, you might spend some time explaining how the moon works and how someone moves on the moon and how heavy they are and how you build structures on the moon. And that stuff will take up space. But I don't think that it prevents you from telling a character-rich story. Scientists have deeply rich lives. They have conflicts and needs and desires and relationships outside of their work. And so even if you're telling a story about a scientist building a time machine, you can do that in a way that's really compelling, and their motivations can be very specific.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Alrighty, our next question is by Seth. What were some of your favorite sci-fi authors growing up?
Le Guin. And
fair.
Yeah. And I mean, to be honest, I'm going to be very honest here. I have a scene in the novel where you look at a character's bookshelf and there's a ton of really good books on it. That was not my bookshelf when I was a kid. I did not read a lot of science fiction personally. I watched a lot of science fiction. My favorite novel when I was a teenager was 1984, which wasn't billed as a science fiction novel, but it is a science fiction novel. It's also incredibly depressing, so you can tell what I was into at that time. so yeah, it took me a while to find science fiction. And I mean, there wasn't a lot of, I didn't have a lot of conversations with peers growing up about the stuff that I was into. It was, I mean, I imagine it's nerdy in the United States, but it's incredibly nerdy in the Virgin Islands. And so there wasn't a lot of people giving me science fiction book recommendations. I got that when I went to college for the most part. But if I was to say like some early influences, definitely Le Guin, definitely Butler, Octavia Butler. Who else? Those were definitely my early influences. Heinlein, I read some Heinlein in college. I read a little bit of Samuel Delany. Who else? I would say, yeah, those were my early readings. Man, where's my brain spacing right now?
It's so hard to kind of think that far back, to try to really kind of grasp onto the names.
I also read some Asimovs. I read some Pohl. I read some. Oh man, there's someone that's on the tip of my tongue, and I'm gonna remember it as soon as I get off the call.
I was gonna say the second we get off this call, it's gonna pop right into your head.
But yeah,
of course.
I feel like that's a decent list. Yeah.
Oh no, for sure. Well, and I think that's a large part of where the importance of people being able to tell these diverse stories. Like, of course, to a certain extent, sci-fi is always going to have some semblance of like nerd factor to it, kind of built within. But I think just the fact that like these days now we're seeing such a wider array of voices telling it, it's not going to feel so alien. Get it? Sorry, I couldn't help it. I love me a dad joke, but it won't feel so alien and like so much of a disconnection because there will be stories that are being told from those viewpoints. I think that's where a lot of that disconnection can happen too,
Yeah, absolutely.
So next question. Ooh, this one I was actually wondering about too. This is a question from Grace. Have you had time to write during quarantine, and how has quarantine been for you?
I've been writing a lot during quarantine. I kind of want to take a break, but I haven't yet. I just finished some edits to my second novel, and I'm doing some more edits to that novel. It's almost there. It's like I think on the seventh or eighth revision. And so, yeah, I've been doing that. And I've also been writing some short stories and stuff like that.
I think that's I can only imagine how hard that has to be, because I think one of the problems with quarantining is just the fact that everything feels incredibly repetitive. Like everyone's just kind of stuck in this loop of not really leaving their house and not really doing much. So I can only imagine that like editing for like the sixth time is just like a reflection of that, like going back over things over and over and over again. That struggle has to be very real.
It is. I mean, it's interesting. Like, definitely, like, I would say like the fourth and fifth revision, I was still very excited about the progress I was making. A lot of what I'm doing now is very monotonous. Just like making sure that everything's right and checking and triple checking, and that stuff isn't, I have to make myself come to the page a little bit more.
No, that's very real. All right. And it looks like our last question, which if anyone has any others, we still have some time left. So feel free to pop a question in here. Grace wants to know what you're currently reading.
That pile that I just showed you. I've been reading a lot of short stories. So I've been reading Tobias Wolff, The Night in Question, Story Collection. Some of these aren't science fiction. A lot of Alice Munro. I really enjoy her writing. Craft books. So I have, look, this crazy pile in front of my desk. I have John McPhee. He's a creative nonfiction writer, draft number 4. It's really good. I have a book. It's somewhere here. It's another craft book called How Fiction Works by James Wood. I've been reading again The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. It's kind of relevant to the book I'm working on. Yeah, there's a ton. Another Alice Munro collection, Dear Life. Yeah. Le Guin. Always Le Guin.
Quarantine has been like a lot of reading and a lot of writing, just kind of flipping back and forth between reading and writing. Yeah.
And still, I don't feel like I'm reading as much as I would like to. There's definitely a lot of books that I've been wanting to get to, and it's been a struggle. It's hard to, even though I've gotten a lot done, it's hard to concentrate right now. It's crazy.
Yeah. That's super real. Ooh, we got another one. Could you tell us a bit about your next novel? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Can you do that?
Yeah. It's the first of a trilogy of books. It's not science fiction. There is some science fiction in it. There's some stuff on like the many worlds principle, which is like a theory of like the multiverse. But most of it is about monsters from Caribbean folklore and popular culture advocating for their human rights. So it's a civil rights book, but the people that are trying to get their civil rights are werewolves and woo-woos and sukunyas and witches and all kinds of fantastic people.
Oh, that sounds dope. I would love for you to come back and talk about that book with us when that book is getting published, because that would be incredible. That sounds like such a good book.
Thank you. It's close. It's close to where I want it to be. It's, revision.
I was going to say, it's always a process. I think that's one thing I find so interesting about the book industry is like people don't necessarily feel just how arduous and long this process can be. It takes years to get a book from concept to printed copy, and
right.
like it's so much work and so many revisions. It's like more revising than writing. At the end of the day, you spend way more time revising the book than you actually writing in many cases.
Yeah, so, and this is just like what I'm doing. They're going to hook me up with an editor, and then I'm going to do some more revision, and then they're going to hook me up with a copy editor, and they're going to copy edit the hell out of this thing. And so, and that's all before the advanced reading copies and the,
right. And then
sending the books around.
For that.
Yeah. It's a very long process.
The whole thing. Actually, that kind of leads into one of the other questions that I wanted to ask was, this was your first published novel, and was there anything really interesting or notable about this process, or was it kind of that, like just the how long it takes? Was there anything else about it that was really interesting?
I mean, I didn't know what I was gonna get out of it. I didn't know who was gonna read it or what the response would be, and so there was a lot of time waiting. There was like several months between the advanced reading copy and when the book actually came out, and I was getting reviews were trickling in, and most of them were positive, but it was a surprise at every step just how many people were feeling the book. Like that was a surprise to me, and it's been a strange year, like getting this feedback about the novel and being on the other side of an author's journey, like wanting to for a very long time to publish, and then having something out there in the world and getting responses back has been surreal.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Okay, so I wanted to ask one more question myself, which is, it's a bit of a cliche question, but I always love hearing kind of how different people answer it. What is something that you would say to someone who is either just getting into writing or trying to get published? Do you have any recommendations for people that are still kind of investigating if they want to be a writer?
Okay, I remember the novelist, the author that I had forgotten. It's Ray Bradbury. I'm so embarrassed. He's awesome. was a really good like early influence on me. Right, the Marshall Chronicles. Anyway, Ray Bradbury. Sorry about that. The answer to that question about advice, I think the most valuable advice that I've gotten on this journey is just like reading things that you love and learning from them. You know, like write the stuff that you enjoy reading and the stuff and the stories and tell the stories you want to tell, and then that's gonna get you most of the way there. I think there's the showing up every day and writing and revising and silencing all of the bad voices in your head that tell you that you can't do this thing. And that's going to be true. But if you are enjoying the work and you're telling the kind of story that you enjoy engaging with, it's gonna help immensely. And then just like, study people that do storytelling really well and learn as much as you can just by reading them. Read them over and over and over again.
Yes. Oh, that's so wonderful. I think that's it for us. I just want to give a huge, huge thank you to you, Cadwell. This has been a wonderful conversation. I feel like I had an opportunity to really dig deep into a book that I fell in love with. So thank you for giving us that opportunity and telling us a bit about your book and your process. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on.
Would you like to tell everyone where they can find you, your social media handles, or anything you have upcoming that you'd like to tell everyone about?
Yeah, you can find me. I'm on Facebook. Pretty easy to find. I'm on Twitter. My handle is Cadwell Turnbull. I'm on Instagram. So I think I'm Cadwell Turnbull author. You can go to my website, which is cadwellturnbull.com. Yeah,
branding.
Right. I'm lucky enough to have a relatively unique name, so it was easy to get the website. But yeah, you can find me on all of those things. I have I was a part of an anthology series called the Dystopia Triptych, and it's a 3-volume anthology. And I wrote a story that was before a dystopia, during a dystopia, and after a dystopia, and all the other authors did their own take on that same premise. It just recently came out. The editors were John Joseph Adams, Christy Yant, and oh my gosh, I am forgetting his name. Anyway, yeah, check it out if you like dystopian fiction.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the lesson is available on paperback. We have it in all of our stores, and it is also available at the link below with that little green button down there. So make sure to get your own copy. This book is really wonderful. I can't recommend it enough. And thanks everyone again for joining us for this really great event. We have a couple other events that are coming up through the rest of the month. On July 21st, we'll be having a conversation about violence and social justice in YA, featuring Kim Johnson and Alex Richards. And then on July 30th, we'll be hosting another panel that is on world building in YA, featuring Rory Power, Christine Lynn Herman, and Amanda Foodie. So make sure to check out our events page on barbarasbookstore.com so you can find out more, including our things like we have Buzzwords Trivia, which is our bi-weekly trivia night. And our next one's on July 22nd, and we'll be featuring a sci-fi round. So we're incredibly excited. I hope that we'll hope to see you there. And thanks everyone again for joining us, and happy reading. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Everybody.